Hello and welcome to, well, a book or two to review, number 10. Defenders of the Norman Crown, The Rise and Fall of the Warenne Earls of Surrey. The Warenne Earls of Surrey. By Sharon, Bennet, Connolly. I love this book. Most books, when you're talking about the medieval period, are talking about kings and queens. They're talking about great battles, great dukes, great nobles. Now, the Warenne Earls of Surrey, they are wonderful people. I have great affection for them. But I wouldn't really call them the most high of the highest. They are certainly powerful. They're not low-ranking nobles by any stretch of the imagination, and they're quite rich and quite capable of causing trouble. But they're their own special kind of power. Now, this is a lovely book. It's got some beautiful pictures in it, which you always like, nice pictures. And the fact that they have so much land, including Conisbrough Castle in South Yorkshire, and Lewes Castle, and Sandal Castle, Peel Castle, shows you their power, and Castle Ecra in Norfolk. Very, very powerful, but not the most powerful family. And Pevensey Castle. Let's see. Now, my favourite chapter is chapter 16. It's the last Earl, and it's the first few pages really for me, which sum up the entire family. John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Warenne, had fathered one legitimate son by his wife, Alice de Lusignan. William was born in 1256, on or before the 9th of February, the day of his mother's death. He was married to Joan, daughter of Richard de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Now, the de Veres are a very old family, and Earls of Oxford have a lot of powerful history in the UK. Sometime in 1284, also William de Warenne married the daughter of Earl of Oxford. Basically, that shows your source. Through his mother, William was nephew of Henry III and first cousin to Edward I. Through his father, William was descended from, among others, William Marshal, Geoffrey of Anjou, and the 6 Warenne Earls of Surrey. William was destined to never to succeed his father. He was killed in a tournament at Croydon in December of 1286, just 6 months after the birth of his only son and heir, John. This year, on June 30th, was born the first begotten son of Sir William de Warenne, by his wife, daughter of the Earl of Oxford, whom he had married as appears above. He was baptized and called by the name of John on the 7th of November, with immense rejoicing. But alas, as the prophet testifies, our joys are extinguished, but lamentation possesses us. For in the same year, on the first Sunday before the feast of Thomas the Apostle, which was on December the 15th, the father of the aforesaid youth, Sir William, killed in tournament at Croydon, concerning whom our gladness has been, expired no sadness. He in whom flourished entire nobility, generosity, and honesty, and the beginnings of the glory of all knighthood, now lies buried and covered with stones. But there was present at the entombment of this so noble a man, the Lord of Canterbury, who buried him before the high altar, on the left side near his mother, with the greatest devotion of respect, as was fitting, many nobles of the land being present, the Earl Marshal, Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, the Earl of Oxford, and several barons were anxiously afflicted. Shows you how powerful he was, but also shows you how powerfully connected he was. No one didn't want to be there for fear of who else might be there, talking without them there. Weddings, births, funerals, they're great networking events. Never forget that. It's terrible and cynical, But literally, every time you see a royal wedding, even today on television, you see the great and the good all there. Just imagine the small talk. Or what passes for small talk. It's networking. It's depressing, but it's networking. Some sources suggest that John was the posthumous son of William, stating that William was killed in January 1286. However, this entry in the Annals of Lewes Priory makes it clear that John was born almost 6 months before his father was killed. John's sister, Alice, on the other hand, may well have been born the year after her father's death, in June 1287. Given the chronicles written by a monk at Lewes, a priory patronised by the Warenne family, the laments and praise of William might be slightly exaggerated. Only slightly. However, that the Archbishop of Canterbury conducted the funeral rites, and the presence of many senior nobles suggests that William was, indeed, well thought of. This fact may give the lie to the rumours of the murder that inevitably accompany a medieval death from unnatural causes. Rumours that William's enemies had taken the opportunity of the tournament to dispatch the young lord appear to be without foundation. I would actually say the more powerful the people are that turn up to your funeral, the more likely you are to have had something go wrong on purpose. I agree, it's unlikely in this case, but frankly, the fact you are so powerfully connected and considering the stakes of the games played with political intrigue in this period, killing someone doesn't seem that unusual. Young John suffered a further bereavement on the 1293 when his mother, Joan, died. Aged only 7, it seems arrangements had already been made should John still be a minor when his parents died. It had been agreed that the custody of John and his land should go to Joan's parents, Robert de Vere and his wife, Alice de Sandford. Perfectly normal. Earls of Oxford, very powerful. However, Earl Robert died in 1296, and it's not known where 10-year-old John spent the remainder of his childhood. It seems likely that John was raised by his grandfather, until the 6th Earl's death in 1304, that is, John de Warenne. At the age of 18, John succeeded to the earldom of his grandfather as the 7th Earl of Warenne, Surrey and Sussex. His vast holdings included lands and manors in Sussex, Surrey, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Wiltshire and Norfolk. John Earl Warenne was still a minor, and would be for another 3 years, so he was made a royal ward, his lands taken into the custody of the crown. Though he and his lands were in royal custody and managed by custodians, John lived on his own estates, and in 1305 the king commanded him to provide him with 40 dried and salted barrels of deer. In the same year, he was sent to attend a tournament at Guildford, part of John's estates, by Edward I, who provided the young lord with considerable funds for his maintenance. On the 7th April 1306, in spite of the fact he had not yet performed homage to the king, Edward granted him his grandfather's lands. It may well have been at this time that Edward Balliol was placed in John's custody. The son of John's aunt, Isabella, and King John Balliol of Scotland, the younger Balliol had been in the custody of his grandfather, the 6th Earl Warenne, from 1299 until the Earl's death in 1304. Given that it's likely his mother was no longer living when John Balliol became king, it seems probable that Edward was born sometime in the 1280s, making him of similar age to his cousin, John de Warenne. John was Balliol's guardian until it was ordered that he be delivered into royal custody in 1310 by Edward II. In May 1306, John de Warenne attended his first Parliament at Westminster, an event which marked his coming of age, although he was not yet 21. In fact, he was still a month shy of his 20th birthday. 21 is when you come of age. You can be married ages before this, but, you don't come of age till 21. John's early coming of age appears to have been part of a larger scheme by King Edward, as during the parliamentary session, John was brought before the king and offered the Edward's granddaughter in marriage. The young earl readily agreed to the marriage. Unsurprisingly, the king himself, Edward I, let's be honest, not the nicest one to piss off, has just said, "Do you want to marry my granddaughter?" The proposed, even though his bride was only 10 years old at the time, so 11 years younger than him. Proposed bride was Joan, or Jeanne of Bar, Edward's granddaughter by his eldest daughter, Eleanor, and her husband Henry, Count of Bar. In the week following the betrothal of John and Joan, and in anticipation of a new expedition against Scotland, on 22nd of May 1306, Edward I held a magnificent ceremony for the knighting of his eldest son, Edward. The king knighted the prince, who then went on to knight other candidates in the glorious setting of Westminster Abbey. In anticipation of the prince's knighting, and in order to gather a body of knights who would be loyal to his son, the king proclaimed that all young men of sufficient age and income should travel to Westminster to be knighted at royal expense alongside their future king. Prince Edward, the ceremony, was also to bestow knighthoods on almost 300 men, John de Warenne included. The young Earl of Warenne was with great nobility was there, with him they him bekeen the Earls Dirth of Bar. There were so many young men to be knighted that it was impossible to find accommodation for them all, and apple trees had to be chopped down in the gardens of the new temple to make room. The prince and his closest companions kept their vigil, the night before the ceremony, watching their arms in the Abbey Church at Westminster. Matthew of Westminster records that there was such a noise of trumpets and pipes and such clamour of voices that one side of the choir could not hear the other. The others kept the vigil at the new temple. The king provided them the necessary scarlet clothes, fine linen belts for their use from his own wardrobe. The following morning, the king knighted his son in the palace of Westminster, investing him with his knight's belts and spurs. The prince then crossed to Westminster Abbey to invest the others. The crowd was enormous, so great indeed that 2 knights were killed. Each candidate was attended by 3 knights, who saw and assisted him through the ceremony. The prince knighted 60 of the candidates himself, with other knights assisting them with the rest. A lavish banquet, which later became known as the Feast of Swans, followed the proceedings. When 2 swans were brought in ornamented with gold network, emblematical of constancy and truth, when they were placed upon the table, the king rose and made a vow to God and to the swans that he would set out for Scotland and avenge the death of Connolly, and punish the treachery of the Scots. It was upon these exceptionally interesting circumstances that Warenne received his knighthood. Now, let's be honest, if you're an earl, and as rich as he is, the odds are the prince knights you himself. Or if he doesn't, the prince is being a very bit of an idiot and is playing favourites in a very impolitical and stupid way. Considering this is Edward II, let's be honest, it could well be the latter, which is why they might not be mentioning that he was knighted by the prince himself. The murder of John Comyn at the hands of Robert the Bruce in the church of Greyfriars in Dumfries on 10 February 1306, following an argument, had sent shockwaves through Christendom. Bruce had then raced to Scone, where he was crowned King Robert I of Scots. As the celebrations continued, a number of weddings also took place, involving several barons and nobles. John's sister, Alice, married Edmund FitzAlan, 9th Earl of Arundel. Of course, Earls Arundel is still going. Edmund had been a ward of John's grandfather. The 2 young men were close in age and were political allies and friends. John de Warenne and Joan of Bar were married on the 25th of May in a lavish ceremony. In a wider world, Edward first died in the summer of 1307 and was succeeded by his son Edward II. John was not immune to turbulence and distrusted Edward's reign and changed sides several times in the arguments between the king and his barons. Initially, John de Warenne was a supporter of King Edward, witnessing the charter which made Edward's favourite, Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, on the 6th of August 1307. On the 2nd of December 1308, John de Warenne was one of the 3 earls who took to the field at the magnificent tournament at Wallingford hosted by Gaveston. The other earls were Hereford and John's own brother-in-law, the Earl of Arundel. Gaveston swelled his ranks with young knights as they faced the 3 knights and their men. Although the new Earl of Cornwall was bested by the earls, he took the spoils and was declared the winner, for it is recognised rule of the game that he who loses most and is frequently unhorsed is adjudged the most valiant and the stronger. Jean de Warenne was so angry at the injustice of the outcome that he showed Gaveston no favour thereafter. In January 1308, Jean de Warenne accompanied the king to France to proclaim his bride, Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. He was present on the 25th of January when 23-year-old Edward met his 12-year-old bride at the doorway of the Cathedral of Boulogne, and the couple exchanged marriage vows. 8 days of celebrations and tournaments followed the ceremony. Sometime during the celebrations at Boulogne, the Earl of Lincoln and Anthony Beck, the Bishop of Durham, gathered together a group of nobles, which included John de Warenne, as Earl of Surrey, to discuss how they could help guide the king through the reforms needed to alleviate the financial burden on the kingdom and solve the Scottish problem. The Boulogne Agreement was a document to which Warenne, Beck, and the Earls of Lincoln, Pembroke, and Hereford all put their seals. It is seen as the first formal step in the mounting opposition to Gaveston. Robert Clifford, Han Talbot, Henry de Grey, John Bortund, and John de Berwick also attached their seals to the document. Anthony Beck, as Bishop of Durham, asked to excommunicate anyone who put their seal to the reform document if they failed in their duty to help the king. The Parliament of April 1308, attended by John de Warenne and his brother-in-law, the Earl of Arundel, demanded that Gaveston be sent into exile. By June, the tide had turned against Edward II, and Gaveston in particular. In order to get Gaveston out of the firing line, Edward created him Lieutenant of Ireland, giving him regal powers far above any held by his predecessors, and the favourite departed for Dublin on the 25th of June. Edward spent the next few months working to smooth the path for Gaveston's return. He held a tournament for Earls, Barons and Knights of England at Kennington in the early autumn. However, the fact that the Earls failed to take part suggests they were not ready to see the things the King's way. From the writs of summons issued by the King, we can assume that John de Warenne attended the Parliament held at Westminster on 24 October 1308, where the Earls recounted their complaints and pressed for the release of Scotland's leading prelates, Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow, and William Lamberton, Bishop of St Andrews, held in captivity since 1306. Edward II was eager to appease the Church in order to smooth the path for Gaveston's return from his Irish exile. The King also agreed to reforms in return for a vote of taxation, though this was not immediately granted. By February 1309, Edward was in a stronger position and may have proposed Gaveston's return to a meeting of his Earls, including John de Warenne, at Westminster on 20th of February. However, the Earls were still not totally behind the King, and met at Dunstable in late March, under the pretext of a tournament to discuss the situation. The gathering was probably led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the King's first cousin. Thomas was the most powerful nobleman in England, and significantly the most vocal of Piers Gaveston's opponents. It was about this time that John de Warenne became a retainer of Thomas de Lancaster. John agreed to serve Lancaster with 80 men at arms and another earl, presumably his brother-in-law Arundel, though this is not certain. The barons set a reform agenda, containing 11 articles, which they intended to present the King at Parliament in April 1308. The Earls complained that the King was abusing his rights of purveyance, just as Edward I had, taking goods at greatly reduced prices and in consequence burning the populace. It was also argued that the jurisdictions of the Steward and the Marshal of the Royal Household had been unjustly extended, and that the King's use of the Privy Seal to offer royal protection was delaying the course of legal process on the common law. 4 new complaints, included in the 11 articles, demanded better control of the issue of pardons to criminals, the abolition of new customs, and an end to the depreciation of the coinage and the provision of receivers to deal with unheard petitions in Parliament. Edward stalled by declaring he would give his response to the next Parliament. All the while, he was working behind the scenes to ease Gaveston's return from Ireland and lift the sentence of excommunication, which had been imposed on Piers Gaveston by Robert Winchelsea, Archbishop of Canterbury. On the 14th of June, 1309, keen to prevent his earls from plotting their opposition to Gaveston's return, Edward issued an order preventing the Earls of Lancaster, Warenne, Hereford, among others, from engaging in tournaments. This was clearly a response to plotting that occurred at Dunstable tournament in March of the previous year. Gaveston returned from his Irish exile on the 27th of July, and John de Warenne again allied with the King. Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln and Lancaster's father-in-law, was instrumental in persuading John to accept Gaveston's return. One chronicle goes so far as to claim that John became Gaveston's man. The Earl of Lincoln, who the year before had been the foremost of barons in bringing about Piers' exile, now became a friendly go-between and mediator. As his repeated and anxious request, the Earl of Warenne, who, ever since the conclusion of the Wellington tournament, had never shown Piers any welcome, became his inseparable friend and faithful helper. See how often and abruptly great men change their sides. Piers Gaveston had forged a few new friendships at this time, and the King became more circumstanced as to where he extended his patronage. Although the perception that Gaveston was the one who directed where the patronage went was still widespread throughout the court. The despised Earl created nicknames for his detractors. Lancaster was the Churl, Lincoln was Burstbelly, and the Earl of Warwick was the Black Dog of Arden. Warwick's response to this nickname was probably indicative of the sentiment of all those opposed to Gaveston. If he call me a dog, be sure that I will bite him so soon as I shall perceive my opportunity. John was with Edward and Gaveston at York in October for a secret parliament summoned by the King, but which the other Earls refused to attend, on account of Gaveston's presence. The Earls were in such fear of Gaveston, apparently, that they insisted on attending the Parliament in February 1310 in arms, claiming that Gaveston was lurking in the King's chamber. For the duration of the Parliament, John, alongside the Earls of Gloucester and Richmond, was appointed to keep the peace in London. The 3 Earls were instructed to provide safe conduct to those attending Parliament, to arrest anyone who broke the King's commands, and to settle any quarrels that broke out during the parliamentary session. Gaveston was sent away for his own safety. The purpose of the Parliament was to decide what action should be taken about Robert the Bruce of Scotland. The topic was never raised as Thomas of Lancaster dominated proceedings with a long list of grievances against the King, including that he was guided by evil counsel, that he could only maintain his household through exhaustion, and was consequently in breach of Magna Carta, that he was losing Scotland, that taxes previously granted in order to fight Scotland were being wasted. Lancaster also complained that the war in Scotland was not being pursued. The Earl called on the King to address the concerns of the barons. Edward initially refused, but eventually acceded to demands. On the 16th of March, issued letters patent authorising the election of 21 ordainers, with the authority to introduce reforms to the government of the kingdom and to the royal household, with a proviso that the reforms were not prejudicial to his sovereignty. The term of office of the appointed ordainers was to run for 1 year from the 29th of September 1310. The composition of the ordainers was a balance of reformers and those sympathetic to the king. John de Warenne was one of only 3 earls not elected, the others being the Earl of Oxford, who was a political nonentity at this time, and unsurprisingly, Piers Gaveston. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce was gaining ground in Scotland, and in March held his first parliament. Edward needed to act. He ordered the army to assemble at Berwick-on-Tweed for 8th of September. With limited finances, the army was small, only 4,700 knights, infantry and archers. Of England's earls, only John de Warenne and Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, answered Edward's summons. The rest, refusing to serve alongside Piers Gaveston, sent the minimum number of men they were required by law to supply in time of war. With no major successes in Scotland that autumn, the king set up his winter quarters at Berwick, Gaveston at Roxburgh, Gloucester at Norham, and John de Warenne was at Wark, all on the Scottish borders. The campaign began again in January, and in February John and the Earl of Gloucester were travelling to Selkirk Forest, seeking out those willing to swear their allegiance to the King of England. When the Earl of Lincoln, left in England to act as Custodius Regini, guarding the kingdom, died on 5th February, the king sent Gloucester south to act as his replacement. John de Warenne remained in Scotland throughout the spring and summer of 1311, with a force of knights and men-at-arms. Edward had rewarded John for his continuing support with a number of gifts, including life grants of 2 Northamptonshire manors, and in June 1310, the castle and honour of High Peak was granted for life, together with the entire forest of High Peak and the improvement of its wastes, with its knights' fees, downsons, wardships, and other abutmences, to hold as fully as William Peveril, sometime lord thereof, had held the same, but subject to a yearly payment to the Exchequer of £437 6 shillings and 8 pence. The annual payment was to be paid in 2 equal instalments of 293 marks, at Michaelmas in September and Easter. In 1310, the majority of his rent was remitted, and in 1311, the payment was remitted for life by the king. Not required. Thomas of Lancaster had married the only surviving child of Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln. With the earl's deaths, Thomas now inherited 2 further earldoms for his wife, Alice de Lacy, adding to his existing earldoms of Lancaster, Leicester and Derby. This now gave Lancaster a total of 5 earldoms and virtually unassailable power base. Lancaster rode north to perform homage to Edward for his 2 new earldoms, but refused to meet the king in Scotland. Edward was therefore forced to cross the border into England to accept Lancaster's homage for the Lacy earldoms of Lincoln and Salisbury. By June, Edward was running out of money and forced to abandon his military activity in Scotland, returning south. In August 1311, Parliament was called and King Edward was presented with the ordinances. Containing 41 clauses, the ordinances were aimed at curbing the power and authority of the king and included that Parliament was to meet once a year, the king was not to go to war, nor leave the country without prior approval, the king could not appoint his own administration, and all evil councils were to be removed and replaced by suitable alternatives. The far-reaching clauses effectively made the king subject to the community of the realm, or rather nobility. In one final blow, Clause 20 called Gaveston evil, saying he had ill-advised the king, detached him from his natural and loyal lieges and his people, had robbed the kingdom and the crown of land, assumed royal dignity, taking offices for himself and his supporters, displacing men of honour. He had taken the king to war in Scotland without the consent of all the nobles, thereby endangering him. In short, Piers Gaveston had to go. He was not just to leave England, but he was to leave Edward's domains altogether. Edward tried everything to keep Gaveston with him, refusing to accept all demands outright until he was advised that he did not have the money or men to fight back. He then offered to accept 40 of the clauses so long as they dropped the clause regarding Gaveston. The nobles were adamant. Anyone would think they knew how poor he was. However, and Edward was forced to accept all 41 ordinances. Piers Gaveston sailed into his 3rd exile on the 4th of November 1311. He was back before Christmas, however reuniting with the king in Yorkshire, just as his wife, Margaret de Clare, gave birth to a daughter named Joan. On the 16th of December, a defiant Edward revoked the ordinance, declaring them prejudicial to the crown and saying he'd been forced to accept them under duress. The king spent the opening months improving the defence of York and Scarborough in preparation to resist whatever the ordainers threw against them. Gaveston's return, not authorised by Parliament, galvanised the opposition against him. More determined than ever to remove the royal favourite, Lancaster and his allies swore an oath they would not rest until the ordinances were reinstated full, and Gaveston was removed from the king. By May, the king, Queen, and Gaveston had moved from Yorkshire to Newcastle, where they were almost captured by a force led by Lancaster. The Queen had then travelled south by road to York, while the king and Gaveston sailed from Tynemouth to Scarborough. Once back on dry land, the king met the Queen at York. leaving Gaveston behind the sturdy walls of Scarborough Castle. John de Warenne was persuaded by Archbishop Winchelsea to join in pursuit of Gaveston. John, his cousins, Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry de Percy, were tasked with bringing Gaveston in. They commenced the siege of Scarborough Castle, with Gaveston inside on the 10th of May. To avoid a protracted siege, the king himself proposed the terms of surrender. Warenne, Pembroke, and Percy were promised on oath to protect Gaveston while he was taken into their custody and escorted to meet the king in Lancaster. If Edward was unwilling to continue negotiations over Gaveston's future, then he was to be allowed to return to Scarborough, and his guarantee of safe conduct would come to an end. During Gaveston's absence from the castle, Scarborough was not to be re-garrisoned, nor restocked with supplies. In return, Warenne, Pembroke, and Percy agreed to the forfeiture of their lands if Gaveston came to any harm while in their custody. Gaveston agreed not to counsel the king to alter the terms of the agreement. With the conditions agreed, Gaveston opened the gates of Scarborough Castle and surrendered on the 19th of May. Warenne, Pembroke, and Percy, with Gaveston in their custody, reached St Mary's Abbey at York on 26th of May. After a heated meeting during which the king promised to satisfy the demands of the Earls at next Parliament, Gaveston was placed in sole custody of the Earl of Pembroke, to be taken south. As Pembroke was escorting Gaveston to his castle at Wallingford, the party were intercepted by the Earl of Warwick, who took Gaveston to Warenne Castle and imprisoned him. 8 days later, Gaveston was put on trial before the Earls of Lancaster, Hereford, and Arundel, accused of treason and sentenced to death. 2 days after that, he was led out to Blacklow Hill, 2 miles north of Warwick, where he was run through with a sword and then beheaded. His body left where it fell. Gaveston's murder enraged Edward. John de Warenne and his cousin, Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, sought out the king in July and begged his forgiveness. Although they had not been involved in the Gaveston murder, they had been unable to prevent it. Edward readily granted his forgiveness. In August, John de Warenne was appointed Keeper of the Peace in Sussex. In the following year, the king issued orders in January-September specifically forbidding John from participating in tournaments. The tournament in September involved Lancaster, Arundel, and 3 other earls. In 1314, John de Warenne refused to join the king's campaign against Scotland, which could culminate in English defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn. John, his brother-in-law, the Earl of Arundel, claimed that they had not been summoned in the correct way and that the campaign had not been sanctioned by Parliament. As the king had secured taxation for the expedition, this last argument was lame, to say the least. The truth was far more personal. Tensions between the king and John were fraught due to John's attempts to seek an annulment of his marriage to Edward's niece, Joan, but more on that later. Basically, he was fed up with waiting to marry a little girl. Although she was getting a bit older by this point, but still. It was being dangled in front of him, and he wasn't keen on it. John de Warenne, despite his failure to take part in the Bannockburn campaign, probably for his own safety, John de Warenne steadfastly supported King Edward throughout the political crisis of the ensuing years. In 1317, he was among a small number of noblemen summoned by Edward to colloque him at Clarendon. Although we do not know what was discussed, it's possible that the continuing problems in Scotland were raised, and the possibility of an attack on Lancaster. Shortly afterwards, John de Warenne abducted Alice de Lacy, Lancaster's wife. In this year, on Monday preceding the accession of a lord, the Countess of Lancaster, the lawful wife of the nobleman Lord Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was seized at Cranford in Dorset by a certain knight of the house and family of John Earl Warenne, with many English retainers called together for the detestable deed, as it said, with the royal assent, and she was conducted with not a little pomp to the said Earl Warenne to his castle at Reigate. And while the lady was so conducted, behold, during the journeying among the woods and fences between Halton and Farnham, the leaders saw at distance flags and banners, for the priests were going with the people, making processions in the usual manner about the fields, rogation days. The conductors, therefore, of the countess, struck with sudden fear and terror, thinking that the Earl of Lancaster or some people sent by him to obtain the said lady and vindicate themselves against so great an injury, fled with all celerity, leaving the countess almost alone. When the truth of the affair was discovered, they returned with threats and bluster. With them was a certain man of miserable stature, lame and hunchbacked, called Richard of the St. Marne. Exhibiting and declaring constantly his evil intentions toward the lady, so miserably led away. He puffed up by great courage, demanded her as his wife, firmly declaring that he had known her carnally before she married the Earl of Lancaster. Also he stated that she publicly acknowledged it and admitted it to be true. Therefore, the said Richard, exalting himself above himself, dared to claim in the king's court of the earldom of Lincoln and Salisbury in the name of his wife, Jure Uxoris, but in vain. Alice was kidnapped in 1317 from a manor in Cranford, Dorset, by John de Warenne's man, Sir Richard de St. Martin, supposedly of the king's knowledge. Several reasons for the objection have been put forward. One is, of course, that Alice and St. Martin had been having an affair, while another is that the affair was between Alice and John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, himself. Given the king's involvement, it may have been an attempt to antagonise the Earl of Lancaster, something John would have been happy to do, given Lancaster's recent obstruction of John's divorce attempt. Alice was held at Reigate Castle, Surrey. Her abduction set off a private war between the two magnates, though Lancaster seems to have made little effort to actually rescue his wife, and there is no record of how and when she was eventually released. In the escalating feud, and unable to strike against the king directly for fear of being charged with treason, Lancaster attacked John de Warenne's Yorkshire estates, which were close to his own castle at Pontefract in October and November, sending forces to seize Warenne castles at Sandal and Conisburg. Lancaster's men found the gates of Conisburg closed for them. The castle was defended by only 6 men, including the town miller and 3 brothers, Thomas, Henry and William Grettard, who were men-at-arms. The siege lasted less than 2 hours, and defenders appeared to have relinquished the castle after apparently putting up a token resistance. The 3 brothers were fined for drawing blood. The chapel in the castle's inner bailey may have been damaged in the brief altercation, as the following year Lancaster sent orders to his Castilian at Conisburg, John de la Salle, to repair la couverture de la chapelle de Conisburg, repair the roof of the Conisburg's chapel. Edward tried to stop the fighting, sending messages to Lancaster. The king has lately heard that the Earl has, with a multitude of armed men, besieged and captured divers castles of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, in the county of York, and that he still detains them, and has done many other things in these parts to disturb the king's peace. Therefore, the king orders him to desist entirely from these proceedings. And if he had done any such things to cause them to be mended in due form, and forbids him to go armed, or to assemble men-at-arms, or to do anything else to disturbance of the king's peace, the king is prepared to do justice in this court concerning the things the Earl is to prosecute against the Earl of Surrey and certain others. Lancaster was relentless, even ejecting John's mistress, Maud de Nefford, from her property. In June 1318, Lancaster attacked John's Welsh lands at Yell and Bromfield. Again, these lands were in close proximity to Lancaster's own property. John de Warenne wrote to the king, complaining of Lancaster's actions on his Welsh estate. The Earl Warenne to the king. The Earl offers reference and all honour to his most noble and most honourable prince, and most dear lord, and wishes the king to understand that news comes to him out of Wales in haste day and night, from his people of Bromford and Yale, that the Earl of Lancaster has, in his letters to them, bid them to atone themselves to him, and that he wishes by all means to have such lands, and has menaced the Earl's said people to the effect that they shall atone themselves to him in one manner or another, which fact the king may more fully see by the transcript of the letter which they have sent to the petitioner, which he sends to the king enclosed with his. It is a great marvel that the Earl of Lancaster wishes to move in such a manner upon the petitioner, more than he has done, since good peace and agreement were lately made between the king and him, and the Earl of Lancaster on all points. In this agreement the petitioner intends that the business between the Earl and himself shall be brought to good end by the means of the king's good lordship, and by his aid and counsel. Wherefore petitioner prays and demands of his highness that on these things he will, if it is pleasure, take counsel and good advice, and will send his letters to the Earl, ordering him to cease from the making or commending such threats against the peace, the dishonour of the king and grave loss of the petitioner, and that the king, if it pleases him, may send other letters to the Justices of Wales and Chester, and to the sheriffs of those parts, that if any people come in force to enter the petitioner's lands, that they, the officers mentioned, may take action, that the king's people in those same parts may be ready with all their power well and openly to withstand, and to defend the petitioner's lands. May the king command these things to be done in the greatest haste possible. In response to John's desperate letter, it was agreed in council that the Earl should be ordered to proceed to Bromfield to protect his territories and ascertain what could be done. It was also decided the Earl of Lancaster should be ordered not to do anything which disturbed the peace. Given that Lancaster gained control of both Bromfield and Yale, it's obvious that he chose to ignore the king's commands. Shortly afterwards, the King and Lancaster temporarily resolved their differences, meeting somewhere between Loughborough and Leicester on the 7th of August, when they exchanged the kiss of peace in front of the court. Within 2 days of the meeting, Roger Duminy and the rest, except Hugh Lee, the defence of the elder, and Earl Warenne, humbly presented themselves before the Earl and were received into his grace. John de Warenne, it seems, was abandoned by the king in the interest of peace, leaving Lancaster to pursue his personal feud with the Earl. John was hunted down and imprisoned in Lancaster's castle at Pontefract. Being in a submission, he was forced to come to terms with Lancaster, coming into an agreement in 1319 which meant giving up most of his Yorkshire estates and some of his lands in Wales and Norfolk, in exchange for land in Devon, Wiltshire and Somerset. Edward, perhaps feeling guilty on how John had been hung out to dry for the sake of national harmony, altered the grant so that Lancaster could only hold the lands during John's lifetime. They revert to John's heirs on his death. John also acknowledged that he owed Lancaster a debt of £50,000, an astronomical sum, though none of it was ever collected. John de Warenne attended a muster in 1319 and went on campaign in Scotland, even if little was achieved. In 1321, the barons again united against the king's new favourites. This time it was Hugh Lill de Spencer, father and son. In July, with Lancaster at Pontefract, the Marshal lords, with a force of 5,000 men, marched to London. Hugh le Despencer the Younger had escaped to France, but the rebels were in demanding the permanent exile of the Despensers. When they entered the city on July 20th of July, Edward refused to meet them. Pembroke, John de Warenne, and the remaining earls, loyal to the king, met with the March of Barons, who attempted to persuade Pembroke to their side. The earls took an oath with the March lords, agreeing to defend their grievances against the Despensers. Pembroke made it clear to the king that he was at risk of losing his throne, and that he himself would withdraw his homage if the king continued his refusal to change his mind. The barons drew Warenne, Arundel, and Pembroke into the attempts to have the Despensers banished to their parliament in August. The Despensers, father and son, were to be permanently exiled by 29th of August, their children disinherited. On 20th August, Edward and his council caused a pardon to be issued to John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, pursuant to the agreement lately made in Parliament last December, of any actions by reason of anything done against Hugh Despencer, le Despencer the son, and Hugh le Despencer the father, between March the 1st and August 19th last. It goes on. He dies at 61, childless. It's a very, very good history. If you're interested in following a family through the ups and downs of the Middle Ages, this is a good book to read. It's an excellent book to read. And it is the last in the medieval period books I have for this series of books. I hope to get some more. Every time I get new ones sent to me, they're really, really cool. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you do like, please like. Maybe even consider subscribing. There's also a little bell down there if you want to hear more. If you want to be alerted when there is a live, and especially. And there are a link to find the book on Amazon down below. And there's Patreon if you wish to support my research, and join in the channel if you wish to support my research. Both different things. Anyway, I'm well over the 15 minutes that this is supposed to be, so thank you very much. Take care, and have a nice day.